You want to punch the world, and I mean really punch the world, in a way that most other Titans will never get to experience. Hey, hi, how are you? My name's Felt. Welcome back to the end of Destiny 2 and my build series that's coming around as a part of it. Today, we're going to be talking about Titans. Well, one Titan build. So doing things a bit differently this time. Around this point of the video, we should have actually transitioned to some gameplay footage in the background. And what you're watching is footage I recorded of this build in action inside of the Grandmaster Defiant Battlegrounds Weekly. And in case you don't know how difficult that is, you are locked 50 power under, which is one of the most brutal deltas you can be at in the whole game. And on top of that, this particular one has the glass cannon modifier, where you take extra damage if you have the most kills, and since I'm obviously solo in the footage, I am the one taking the most damage. So, as I'm sure you can realize by what you're seeing in front of you, this build is incredibly survivable, does a lot of damage, and really just blows stuff up. This build quite literally focuses around meleeing the game to death so hard that it can't do anything in response, debuffing stuff with giant piles of strand and arc debuffs so that they are constantly taking extra damage from everything you do, and living out your best Titan fantasies. You get to punch the world. Now, just like most of these videos, we have to start by talking about the exotic, because if you don't understand the exotic that we're using, the build won't make any sense. The exotic we have is the Point Contact Cannon Brace. Its exotic perk is Hammer of the Gods. Defeating targets with your Thunderclap melee restores melee energy. Targets near you when you use your Thunderclap suffer lightning strikes and become jolted. Being amplified increases the damage of these lightning strikes. This build massively debuffs enemies in an AoE around you by jolting them, and then if you actually succeed in hitting something with a melee and killing it, you will refund some melee energy. This synergizes with a lot of the rest of the build, but most importantly, you just need to realize that this is the chargeable Thunderclap melee only. That is the only melee you can use with this build. So you have to learn how the melee works at its core before you really start learning how this build functions. Thunderclap has a tiny learning curve, but it's really not that complicated. This build uses Prismatic Titan as its core because Prismatic Titan offers a lot to any Titan, and I find that Prismatic Titan gives you what you need to make this build work better in a way that Arc Titan doesn't. My super of choice for this build that I think is the best option is Twilight Arsenal. In case you don't know what it does, you summon 3 Void Axes and throw them back to back to back. On impact, the axes pull in nearby targets and detonate in weakening explosions, meaning that you do apply weaken with this ultimate, or super, apologies. Been playing too much Deadlock. And then after the axes do their damage, you can pick them up and use them some more, which is one of the things that I think is pretty powerful about this build. You are already a very powerful ad clear build. This either buffs the hell out of your ad clear to absurdity, or gives you a little bit of much needed burst damage that you can apply to bosses that you otherwise wouldn't have. Since this is a prismatic build, we do have access to Transcendence. Transcendence, in case you don't know how it functions, charges based off the type of damage you do. You have 2 miniature bars that you have to fill up, and when they are both filled, you can activate Transcendence. When you pop it, you get a new grenade, faster energy regen. When you do damage with melee, you get grenade. When you do damage with grenade, you get melee, and you get a little bit of weapon damage, and kills inside it extend the duration. It's just an incredibly powerful way to take this build from, in my opinion, A+ tier to completely S tier and high-end content. Mostly because of the new grenade, we get Electrified Snare. This is a bouncing grenade similar to a suppressor and how it's thrown, that when it detonates, it does a strand and arc blast that jolts nearby targets as well as suspending them, which just does so much for this build because of so many of the other things that are inside of it, but we will get to all of that later. The abilities of choice do matter in this build quite a bit for what I like to do with it. First of all, I like Rally Barricade. A lot of people say the Thruster is the way to go with any Prismatic Titan. For this build in particular, I really recommend Rally Barricade. If you've watched the footage, you get why. If you don't get why, you'll see why in a second when we get to aspects. As for jump, I think Catapult Lift is the way to go, but obviously if you have a different preference, go for it. I am no Titan aficionado. Titan is my least played class. This is in fact the most fun I've had in Titan, and that's the only reason I'm making this build. Thunderclap is our melee of choice and is required. I talked about it when I talked about the exotic itself, but this melee is required. You have to use this melee, otherwise, why do you have on the exotic? Grenade of choice, I prefer the Shackle Grenade because I think Shackle Grenades are just stupid strong. You can argue for a Glacier Grenade to be another source of darkness damage for your build, but I personally think that Shackle Grenade is the way to go because I think suspending stuff is just better than shattering stuff, at least for this particular build. As for aspects, one of them is Knockout. Critically winning a target or breaking their shield infuses your melee attack with arc energy, increases your melee range. This doesn't really matter that much because we're going to almost always have up our charged melee, so we'll almost never be using the default version of this, but it is there in case you didn't know how it worked. Defeating targets with melee attacks makes you amplified and restores a portion of your health. Defeating more powerful combatants increases the amount of health restored. That's the part that matters. Free amplified and extra regen for the build that already does not suffer for healing itself. This just makes you nigh unkillable as long as you pay attention and make sure that you're actually using your melees correctly. A bit of an odd one that I don't see too many people using lately, Drenger's Lash is our other aspect. When you activate your barricade, this does work with the thruster, but it drops it behind you, which is why I don't like the thruster, I prefer the barricade. And you create a ripple in front of you that is a line ability that suspends anything that it hits. Final blows on targets affected by Suspend, Unravel, or Sever grant class ability energy. It does increase in damage if your class is 100 or higher. We don't typically get to that point though because we have too many other stats we need to invest in. But as you realize here, because of the fact that we are constantly applying stuff with Shackle Grenade and Electrified Snare, we are actually getting crazy fast regen on our class ability, meaning that we can continuously suspend stuff more often than we would be able to otherwise, just completely dominating the battlefield. Next up is Fragments. Facet of Honor is our first choice here. Collecting an elemental pickup or destroying a tangle grants Transcendence energy of the same type. This is incredibly powerful because if we make Ionic Traces, we will get a lot of light energy. Because we're doing a lot of strand stuff, we're making tangles, so we're going to get a lot of dark energy. The same would apply if we were doing Fire Sprites or Void Breaches or Stasis Shards or any of that, but Ionic Traces and Tangles are the two most important things to remember for this build. It also gives us 10 free melee. We're a punch build, we love that. Next up is Facet of Hope. When you have an elemental buff, your class ability regenerates more quickly. This is just more free class ability regen, as if we needed it, but it is nice to have in case you're not killing stuff as fast as you would be. But I don't foresee that happening very often, but it is powerful. Facet of Courage up next. Your Arc, Solar, and Void abilities deal increased damage to targets afflicted with darkness debuffs. Suspend, Unravel, Sever, all of that stuff, darkness debuffs. That means that our melee hits that stuff harder than anything in the game, just about, I swear. Not literally, obviously, but it sure does feel that way. Facet of Protection is here for extra protection for ourselves. Lots of damage reduction that gets increased while we're Transcendence, plus 10 free melee energy. Who wants to turn that down? Last but certainly not least is Facet of Purpose, and another one of the reasons why we choose Twilight Arsenal for our super. Picking up an orb grants a buff based on the damage of your equipped super. We get overshields because we have a Void super on. Because we have so much health regen and so much damage reduction through other various means, just getting an extra overshield that goes over top of our health bar is one of another really good ways to ensure our survivability. Before I move on to any other part of the build, I'm giving a quick mention to Diamond Lance. You can use that over Drenger's Lash in the build if you are someone who likes using stasis stuff. However, I have personally found in my gameplay that Drenger's Lash suits the build a little better than the occasional Diamond Lance. I more often than not don't actually shatter or freeze stuff enough to make good use of Diamond Lances with this build, and using Drenger's Lash is a very simple way to make sure that I'm still applying strand debuffs and suspending stuff constantly and doing battlefield control in another way. If you are a massive fan of Glacier Grenade, I might recommend doing Diamond Lance because then you can use Glacier Grenade with Diamond Lance to cause even more freezing on the battlefield, but don't recommend as much as the version that will be down in the description. If you've been doing in-game builds or powerful builds, you'll probably be used to seeing Tablet of Ruin in them. Tablet of Ruin is just an incredibly powerful artifact with access to a lot of good stuff, and let's talk about those good stuffs. First up, we have To Shreds, dealing sustained damage to severed targets, unravels them, and makes hotspots of Woven Mail if you defeat them. This gives our build Woven Mail that stacks on top of our overshields and our healing and our damage reduction and everything else that we have in the build that makes us so much harder to kill. This is incredibly powerful, 10 out of 10 thing. Our other option for our T3 perk is absolutely up for debate. In most content, where you are not desperately cloying for any piece of damage that you can find, Defibrillating Blast is my go-to. Defibrillating Blast gives you Bolt Charge when you stun a champion, and when you damage targets with Bolt Charge, the bolts jolt them. Why did Bungie make this a tongue twister? And heals you. Now, this is incredibly good in content where there's an abundance of champions, because you will constantly have Bolt Charge, you will constantly be proccing it, and you will be constantly healing yourself through all of the damage that you deal, and this makes you super survivable. If you're doing content solo, I highly recommend this. It's probably your best thing. But if you're doing team content, and you need a little bit more damage out of the build in terms of weapon stuff, definitely swap this out for Particle Reconstruction. Fusion Rifles and Linear Fusion Rifles are really strong in the game right now, especially because of stuff like particle reconstruction being in it. And this is a pretty safe swap, especially if you're doing, say, harder dungeons or raid content, and you like this build for the ability to kill all the adds in the world, but when boss damage comes up, you're lacking a little bit. Particle reconstruction helps make up for that lack of damage, and linear fusion rifles already being so good means that you now just get even more buffs to them and makes them even stronger and actually able to keep up with other people. As we go down the tablet here, next up is flashover. When you gain maximum bolt charge, you become amplified. Not that important, we're amplified a lot anyways, but lightning bolts deal more damage, meaning that whenever we get bolt charge rolling, we will deal more damage with the bolts. It's very nice. Horde Shuttle's in here because you'll probably be unraveling stuff, and that synergizes very well with to shreds because your threadlings will sever stuff, and then shreds cares about the threadlings severing stuff from the Horde Shuttle spawns, and it's part of the core threadling woven mail production that Tablet of Ruin has. If you get it, you get it. Next up is Photonic Flare. Defeating an exhausted or severed target with arc damage releases a blinding burst. Well, we're severing a lot of stuff, aren't we? And overload weapons automatically exhaust enemies. And so many weapons just have overload by default now, you're going to be proccing a lot of blinding bursts. This helps you continue to control the battlefield when you're not constantly suspending or jolting everything in sight. Dielectric is up next. Defeating arc debuffed targets grants bolt charge. That synergizes well with the rest of our build now, doesn't it? Rapidly defeating arc debuffed targets spawns an orb of power and heals a small portion of health. Wow, even more survivability for a build that doesn't lack for it. And finally, unraveling orbs to just synergize with the strand portion of the build. We are a very focused build and we want arc and we want strand, and that is the majority of what we want. This synergizes super well with any arc weapons in the game and is just incredibly powerful. It also very easily triggers stuff off of Horde Shuttle because you will be constantly unraveling stuff because your strand weapons will have unraveling rounds. So now that we've talked so much of the basics of this build, let's talk weapons. My default loadout for this build is what you were watching earlier. It is Barodiad, Lotus Eater, and Hammerhead, but let's talk about everything that I generally recommend for this build. First up, Barodiad is a weapon that I really recommend. I think that this weapon synergizes super well with what we want to do. It kind of fills a niche of having a primary ammo weapon that does a little bit of extra damage overall, because in case you don't know, the Blight Seekers of this thing do a ton of damage. The version that I like to run is Taken Ambition, which is you get more Blight the longer you shoot stuff, combined with Target Lock Refit. You can do the other version, which is One for All, and then the other Taken trait that makes it so that you gain more Blight the more you shoot various targets. It's up to you. This is the version that I like to run, simply because this weapon is kind of filling a niche of a little bit of extra damage that I can pump out randomly because you can just kind of charge up the Blight while shooting enemies, and then reload and dump all your extra Blights into stuff whenever you so feel. Now, other options for this top slot here that I recommend, Mint Retrograde. It's just a good weapon. Even with its nerfs against bosses, this weapon is just incredibly good. I do think we're not the best at using elemental honing in this build because we're really just focused on the two types of damage being arc and strand typically. But if you don't have anything better, you can use elemental honing. Bait and switch is a primo one if you want to make sure that this does as much damage as humanly possible. But just about any damage boosting perk that you can find on this thing is pretty great. It is just an incredibly good weapon overall, top to bottom, does just about everything you'd want. Absolute workhorse, even with its like 30% damage nerf to bosses that I got lately. As for another top slot weapon that I recommend, Scatter Signal. Now, I can't recommend this in super good faith because, to be completely honest, at the time of recording this video, I don't even know how you get this weapon in this game anymore. This is from an old season, Season of the Wish, and this exact roll is almost everything that I ever want in a strand fusion rifle. You can get Liquid Coil so it does a little more damage considering it's rapid fire, Slice so that you continuously debuff stuff, Controlled Burst so that the more you shoot a target the better it does, which does synergize very well with Particle Deconstruction and the Artifact so that you can just continuously ramp up your damage a lot because it's pretty easy to hit all your bolts for Controlled Burst damage. Combine that with the damage of the other thing and this is a very good backup DPS weapon. Plus it has a crazy good origin trait that when someone dies, not the best, or when you reach critical health, this auto refills and gets better everything for a little bit, making this just an absolute workhorse for this build. If you have one of these that's craftable, I recommend breaking it out, getting it up to tier 5 and putting this on it, but if not, the next easiest thing to farm for this build is the Tahoma 01. This is farmable from distortion events. This is a different type of fusion rifle though. It's an aggressive frame that fires horizontally, so it's a little bit weirder. As for perks to put on it, I Personally, I'm always a fan of overflow when it comes to fusion rifles because I don't want to reload this thing ever. But it can also get stuff like lead from Golden Feeding Frenzy in the first column that are also pretty good. This roll is almost exactly what I'd want on this thing. The only thing is I don't have Controlled Burst, but Controlled Burst is hard for me because I don't aim very well with the horizontal volley on this thing. Aggregate charges on here because it's just pretty good free damage because you'll typically be applying at least 2 elements of debuffs to a target, but stuff like Desperate Meshes and Rampage are also very good for just generally pumping damage. My de facto energy slot weapon that I almost always run with this build is the Lotus Eater because Repulsor Brace destabilizing rounds is crazy good. If you don't think you need Repulsor Brace to help with extra overshields, you can get something like Reconstruction in the first column, but this is just the best roll for this weapon, and so as a result, it's what I recommend. It's just really good. If you want to use potentially a different weapon in this slot, the Echolos SMG is just an example, but basically any arc SMG that you can find with Volt Shot or Jolting Feedback sits incredibly well in the slot. I just really like my old Echolos now that I can get it up to tier 5. But just about anything can sit in this slot and be just fine, as long as it has the requisite arc perk. One last mention of things that I think fits in the slot really well includes the Palindrome. You might notice that I'm mostly sticking with arc weapons if it's not specifically the Lotus Eater, and that's just because if I'm not going to be using the Lotus Eater, I want to just heavily synergize with the arc portion of what I am doing with this build in the Palindrome, and arc SMGs with Volt Shot or Jolting Feedback just kind of do exactly that. And if I'm using a primary in the middle slot, I'm probably using a fusion rifle in the top slot anyways. And as a result of that, I want my primary to make sure that it synergizes with the other half of my build. Starting simply for the heavy slot, Hammerhead is my go-to recommendation because I think this is possibly the best LMG in the game. It can roll some of the best perks in the game. My personal fun roll for fun is Onslaught Rewind rounds, so I never have to really reload the gun, and I just kind of hold left click, mowing stuff down and shooting faster until it's all dead. There's obviously better rolls and different rolls, but it's just a workhorse of a gun that does well in 99% of content until you need boss damage. A legendary boss damage weapon that I will recommend is the Mistral Lift. Particle Reconstruction synergizes with it very well because it's a 3-round burst weapon, but it's also a Viced Stinger weapon, which means it'll auto-reload itself, which means once you proc bait and switch, you don't have to worry about swapping off of it until the timer runs out. This version of a Void Linear can also run Envious Arsenal, which I highly recommend getting if you want to, simply because it means that when you're reprocking bait and switch, you will just not have to worry about manually reloading the gun ever, because you'll reproc it, Envious Arsenal will go, bet you reprocced bait, and then when you pull it back out, it'll have the damage buff ready to go, and it'll be completely reloaded, and then Vice Stinger, yada yada. Self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't know where to get this, this is dropping from Dawning engrams in the tower as part of the Monuments of Triumph everything. It might take a while to farm it out because there's a lot of engrams in that, but it is a very easily attainable thing because it's so easy to farm legendary marks. The Fafnir is actually something that I highly recommend if you're running this build in higher end content and you want to be a good team player because of the massive debuff that the weapon applies. The exotic perk down here, Quantum Nova, when you eat your reserves to give it a massive weakening shot, it applies a weakening debuff that is as strong as Tractor Cannon. The only downside of it is that you eat your reserves and it takes a while to charge up and the debuff doesn't last super long, but it is still extra damage compared to a Tractor Cannon, and you can shoot this, swap to, say, a fusion rifle, like the Scatter Signal, to DPS a bit, and then swap back to apply this again, and be a team player who's also doing at least a little bit of extra DPS along the way. If you want to use exotic power weapons and you want to do a bit more damage, may I recommend Queensbreaker. It's just kind of a workhorse heavy weapon because of the catalyst giving it rewind rounds. That's a fun one to say, ain't it? And it just generally being a really good weapon that procs particle reconstruction really quickly. Final recommendation is Sleeper Simulant. This weapon has kind of seen a bit of a resurgence thanks to the artifact perks that buff it. If you have the catalyst, it's more recommended than if you don't, but it's still usable without the catalyst. It's massive base damage, and the buffs that it gets from particle reconstruction are just crazy. It makes it a really good fallback heavy weapon to do for DPS that synergizes well with the rest of the build, simply because it means that you're getting double duty out of the particle buff because you're also probably going to be using a fusion rifle in your top slot. Let's talk armor sets. This build has one armor set that I recommend. One. The number one set that I recommend for it is the Luminopotent set. The 2-piece buff is fine. The fusion rifle and your fusion rifle buffs are fine, and we kind of like using those weapons with this build anyways, so I don't hate it because you're usually amplified. But what we love is the 4-piece bonus, which is final blows with Jolt or against Jolted combatants create ionic traces. You probably noticed that in the gameplay footage and were wondering this whole time where those came from. It's from our armor set. It's why I don't recommend any other armor set. The amount of extra ability regen that we get, and the amount of extra buffs that we get from running this armor set, because of the amount of jolt that we apply with just our melee, not even counting the weapons that we might be using, is insane. You can basically just cycle through your abilities over and over and over again without having to worry whatsoever about anything. It is by far and away the de facto armor set for this build, and if you don't have a good set of it for this build, go farm one out before you really try it. I tried to do this build before having the 4-piece, and it did not feel near as fun. I will be nice, and I will include another usable armor set if you've already farmed it out for other builds. The Coda armor set is probably the only other armor set that I think would work for this build to synergize with the concepts that I have for it, which is the Strand Arc duo elements. In case you don't know how this works, final blows with light give you light polarity, which gives you grenade stat. Final blows with dark or kinetic give you stacks of dark polarity, which buffs your melee stat, which means that overall this just generally buffs your ability regen. The 4-piece bonus basically gives you super powered versions of that, where they just grant the energy itself, additional grenade and melee energy respectively, and if you alternate final blows between the two types of damage, you get periods of damage resistance. Damage resistance isn't super necessary on this build, as I'm sure you realized from watching the intro footage, considering I was using Luminopotent there. But it is nice, and if you already have this armor set farmed out because you're using it for a different Titan Prismatic build or something like that, it will work in a pinch. I just really recommend the other one more, because all the ionic traces really make that build just come together better. Last but certainly not least, let's talk stats and armor mods. First up, stats. I recommend 200 melee if you can get it. The melee slaps, it does a ton of damage, and I recommend getting 200 melee if you can. Personally, I do say 180 over 160. For those of you who don't know, font mods give you 20 extra of a stat if they are active, but if you want to make sure that you have certain mods available for your gloves, you probably only want to have one font in it, so you probably want to have 180 melee stat. We do get a good chunk extra from the subclass though, so don't forget about that when you are build crafting. After maxing out the melee stat, I personally like to go for super stat. I think super as the next stat really helps the build function as the add clear demon that it is, but you can argue that weapon should be the next stat as well. I personally recommend super, and in fact I slot in a couple of super fonts in my build so my super hits even harder. After super, it is weapons, because you want your weapons to do as much damage as possible, and when you get it above 100, you want that extra ammo chance as much as possible. That is something that I do notice when playing this build over other builds on my other characters. I don't get near as much ammo on this build as I do on other builds. And now after those three stats, it's kind of a toss-up. I do like a decent amount of class, because I like being able to use Drinker's Lash efficiently. After that, having Grenade for extra shackle grenades is nice, but with how Ionic Traces and how Drinker's Lash recharges those two abilities, you don't need them to be super high, and if they're a little lower than what I have right here, don't worry about it. Health is a throwaway stat, don't worry about it. You'll probably get some on accident, because to get armor with high melee stat, you typically need to have one of the armor sets that has health on it. But I try and dump it as much as possible. As for actual armor mods, I kind of spoilered myself a little bit, but that's okay. Super mods to hit my different breakpoints that I want, as well as whatever tuner mods help me hit my breakpoints. I'm using Harmonic Siphon for Void Siphon at the moment, but that is simply because the default version of the build uses Void weapons in it. You can replace this with either Powerful Friends or Radiant Light, if you so choose, or even Special Ammo or Heavy Ammo Scouts, if you want to help out your fire team a little bit. Outside of that, I like using double super fonts so that I can get massive amounts of super damage. My super stat when I pick up an orb is basically 140 instead of 100, and that feels really good. As for the gloves, it's the same general armor mod and tuner mods to help me hit whatever stat breaks I want. A melee font to make sure I have 200 melee, heavy-handed to make sure my punch kills actually grant me orbs, and then I like impact induction, Causing damage with a powered melee reduces your grenade cooldown. Since my grenade stat is the lower one, I'll use this one. If my class ability was lower, I would be using Focusing Strike to get class ability energy when I deal damage with a melee attack. Chest piece, same with mods, but then our resist mods, it just depends on what type of content we are in. Ammo generation mods could be useful for this build because we don't really break 100 weapon very often. If you're going to, I'd recommend whatever special weapon you have be the generation mods you do. If you're running the special fusion rifle in the that's Strand, use the Strand. If you're using the Void one, use Void, but this build can tear apart high-end content, and you don't really use those in high-end content. You mostly just use resistance mods to make sure you don't die, and so just slot in whatever resistance mods make you not die. As for the boots, I am using weapon surges that help my special weapon out and heavy weapon out the most. I'm using an Orbs of Restoration because we heal so much naturally we don't need anything that heals us when we pick up orbs, so this just gives a little bit of extra ability energy to the build. You can replace the weapon surge mods with whatever weapon surge you're using. If you're using a Strand special weapon, use Strand Surge. If you're using a Solar Heavy that you want to buff, use Solar. The weapon surge aren't super important, just use 2 of them in whatever your main weapon's damage type is. For the class item, Reaper, Time Dilation, Powerful Attraction, the classic trio, just use it, it's great. There's very few other options that I want to recommend. You could potentially say Outreach, but I still think this is the classic trio that you should be searching for. So that's that. That's everything you should need to know about this build, how to pilot it, how to gear for it, my recommendations for it top to bottom. I hope you enjoyed. There's still more Destiny builds to come. I believe I have a handful of Hunter builds and Warlock builds in the work, and maybe one more Titan build. But obviously, since we're not getting any more Destiny, if you are only here for the Destiny, don't subscribe. But if you want to see more stuff from me, I'd really appreciate it if you do. It helps the channel. We play lots of other stuff around here. I play a lot of Deadlock, if you're a fan of that. I play a lot of indie games. Those playthroughs usually go up to the channel, and I like lots of roguelike and roguelites. For example, there will be some more Slay the Spire content going up on the channel soon, and if it's not already out, there should typically be some Slay the Spire 2 stuff just sporadically popping up here and there. But thank you for hanging out and watching. Y'all are all cool, and I appreciate you, and I hope to catch you all in the next one.